Hi, it's Clemmy from the NARM Clinic, and in this week's video I want to talk about dairy and the impact it may have, either positive or negative, on inflammatory bowel disease. This is following on from last week's video where I talked about gluten and the impact it can have, so if you haven't seen that, then go and check it out. So first of all, what is dairy? So dairy refers to the group of foods that contain or are made up of animal milk. So this includes milk, cream, butter, cheese, and yogurt, but it doesn't include eggs. I know that some people get confused about that. So many dairy products come from cows, but dairy products also come from goats and sheep. So for example, things like feta cheese is made from sheep's milk. So what are the problems that people can have with dairy? So there's three main ones. So milk allergy is the first one. So this is an allergic reaction to foods containing dairy. So if someone with a dairy allergy eats any dairy containing foods, the reaction usually happens quite quickly and sometimes within minutes. And they're very much allergic symptoms. So swelling, itching, irritation of the mouth or throat, hives, headaches, difficulty breathing, cramps, nausea, vomiting, and then sometimes anaphylaxis as well. And the only way to solve this is a total avoidance of dairy and all dairy containing products. The second one is lactose intolerance. So lactose is the sugar that's found in milk, so the natural sugar that's found in milk. And someone who is lactose intolerant doesn't produce the enzyme called lactase, which helps to break down lactose in the small intestine. And that means that the lactose, the sugar, passes through the digestive tract undigested, and this causes symptoms like diarrhea, bloating, gas, and nausea. So why might someone have it? So a person's ancestry and genetics plays a very important role in their risk of developing lactose intolerance. So Asians and Native Americans have the highest prevalence of lactose intolerance at more than 90% of that population. There's around a 60 to 70% prevalence of lactose intolerance in Black Americans, Arabs, Jews, Hispanics, and Southern Europeans, so Italians and Greeks. And the prevalence is lowest in people with Northern and Western European and American ancestry, and that's around 10 to 15% of the population. Now, a person can also develop lactose intolerance if the lining of the small intestine, which is where lactase, the enzyme, is produced, is damaged in some way. And this can happen, for example, in Crohn's disease or in some kind of infection, passing infection. But this usually rectifies itself when the damage is repaired, so that tolerance then changes and increases again when the damage has repaired. Now, for most people with lactose intolerance, opting for a lactose-free dairy products is sufficient. So that's where during the manufacturing process and bottling process, the manufacturers have just added that external enzyme lactase, which breaks down the sugar, and that's usually enough to reduce symptoms in most people. And another option is to take tablets of lactase enzymes with dairy-containing meals. For some people with lactose intolerance, actually research has shown that they can tolerate a certain amount of lactose per day. So studies have shown this to be about 12 to 15 grams of lactose, which is the equivalent of around 250 mils, a glass of milk. But each person's tolerance is different, and some people may not be able to tolerate any at all. And the third problem that people can have is a dairy intolerance. Now, some people report that dairy still causes them symptoms, digestive symptoms, even if they've tested negative for lactose intolerance, and they've also tried lacto-free dairy products and symptoms still persist. So dairy intolerance is less well understood. We don't really know the mechanisms behind it. It's not an allergy or a lack of enzymes. But one explanation could be that it's an intolerance to the proteins, or an inability to break down the proteins, which are called casein and whey in dairy. Now, we can test for dairy allergy, we can test for lactose intolerance, but there is no way of testing for dairy intolerance. And again, the same as last week, there are food intolerance tests available on the internet, many of them very expensive. These have very little research to back them up and back up their efficacy, so don't waste your money on those. So what about dairy and inflammatory bowel disease? So some people with IBD do experience symptoms like bloating, gas, pain and nausea when they eat dairy containing foods. And this could be because they have a lactose intolerance, or it could be because they have a dairy intolerance. Now, let's cover lactose intolerance first in IBD. So lactose intolerance is actually more common in people with Crohn's disease of the small intestine, which makes sense considering what I was talking about before, as this in the small intestine is where lactase, the enzyme that breaks lactose down, is produced. And one study found that the prevalence of lactose intolerance changed depending on the location of Crohn's. So if you have proximal small bowel Crohn's, you're pretty much 100% likely. They found the prevalence in that study of that group of people. In the terminal ileum, around 68%, terminal ileum and colon 54%, and then the colon 43%. On the other hand, people with ulcerative colitis seem to have the same chance of being lactose intolerant as the general population. So that doesn't really change the risk for people with UC. Now, there's not that much data on dairy intolerance in IBD, as this can't be tested for, so it's usually self-reported. But in my clinical experience, dairy intolerance does exist in some patients with IBD. And I've also found that people's personal tolerance to dairy can change depending on whether they're in active disease, so having a flare, or whether they're in remission. And that goes back to, again, the lactose intolerance perhaps, or during flare-up times, and the damage that that can cause to the lining of the intestine. On the other hand, there is some research that actually suggests that dairy could be beneficial for people with IBD. So it's very nutritious and provides us with some really important nutrients, and I'm going to come on to that a bit later. But particularly dairy kefir. So kefir is a fermented dairy product that contains bacteria that can help support the microbial balance. So those microbes that live within our intestine that help to keep us healthy. And researchers have found that kefir consumption may actually help to change in a beneficial way the gut microbes, and regular consumption of kefir may improve a patient's quality of life with inflammatory bowel disease. This was a small and short-term study, but I think it's quite interesting. Much more research is needed, but kefir is something that's really easy to include in your diet if you tolerate dairy, and can be bought at most supermarkets. The brand that I like is Yo Valley. They do a good kefir yogurt. So what to do? If you think you might have a lactose intolerant or be intolerant to dairy, there are some really important things to consider before removing it. So you can have a test for lactose intolerance. So my first piece of advice would be to get help. So if you want to remove dairy, then you should only do this under the guidance of a qualified nutrition professional, because there are risks associated with removing dairy. One of these is malnutrition, which is already a worry for people with inflammatory bowel disease and absorption issues. And dairy does provide important nutrients in many people's diets, including protein, which is vital for growth and repair, particularly if you're going through a flare-up. And recovering, calcium, also iodine, potassium, phosphorus, vitamins B2 and B12. And these and many other nutrients are really important for our health and for our recovery. So we need to make sure that if we're moving dairy, then we're getting these nutrients from other foods, and a nutritionist can help you with that. Another thing to bear in mind is there are some additives in dairy-free milks that may potentially have an impact on IBD. There's one in particular that's been studied called carrageenan, and we think that might have an impact on relapse rates in inflammatory bowel disease, particularly in ulcerative colitis, so that's something to be aware of. Also, dairy-free products can be expensive. If you opt for lots of dairy-free alternative products, then this can make your weekly shop more expensive. So it's really important to get guidance on how to best follow a dairy-free diet, so it's not only better for your health, but also for your wallet. Second last one is restrictive diets can decrease quality of life. So dairy is really found in so many everyday foods, and if you're already on a very restrictive diet, it may not be the right thing for you quite at the moment. And if done without guidance, it can actually cause more stress and anxiety. And we know that stress and anxiety has a big impact on inflammatory bowel disease. If you want to read more about that, then I did a blog post and a video about that a few weeks ago, so go and check that out on my website. And the last thing is dairy is probably only one piece of the puzzle. So it may be an important one for some people, particularly with lactose intolerance in terms of symptoms and dairy intolerance. But it's not going to be probably the magic silver bullet that solves all your problems. I'm often talking about pieces of the puzzle because it's never one thing that is going to help reduce symptoms. There's often lots of different things that we have to bring together, and generally looking at more than just one part or one food group in a diet. So we need to look at all the pieces of the puzzle, and this includes foods, it includes nutrients, it includes deficiencies, it includes gut health, sleep, stress, movement, and also then how all these interlink to help or to hinder your progress. It's also really important that we're not always looking and focused on what we need to remove from our diets, but rather what we can include in our diets that may be supportive for inflammatory bowel disease. And ultimately, my aim as a nutritionist is for all my clients to improve their quality of life and to help them achieve nutritional balance through the least restrictive diet as possible. So the takeaway, if you think dairy is causing you problems, you should speak to your GP, to your gastroenterologist, or to a nutritionist like myself. And if you are advised to stop eating dairy, then you need to ensure you're getting your calcium and other nutrients from other sources. Anyway, I hope that was helpful, and we'll see you again next week. If you enjoy my videos, don't forget to subscribe, and then you'll be notified each time that I put them on. Thanks very much. Take care.